producer, a consultant to the film industry, and he made very important film like the Cosmos based on the award-winning PBS, and we're just talking about this the Mars series, and then he's currently involved in the Orville, produced by Fox and Hulu. So basically, he's has the you can see here. I'm trying to kind of read it just a little bit. So he's a writer, consultant, television producer, currently serving as a writer and co-executive producer of the Fox Hulu television series, the Orville. He's also the writer and consulting producer on the latest season of the Fox National Geographic television series Cosmos, based on the award-winning PBS series created by Carl Sagan and Anne. In 2016, he was the head writer and co-executive producer of the Mars documentary drama series for the National Geographic Channel. That series actually featured Elon Musk, Buzz Aldrin, Robert Zubrin, several other people. Then later, he worked in 2010, 2011. He worked as a writer consultant for the Disney XD animated series Tron Uprising, based on the feature film Tron Legacy. So basically, instead of reading through this, I'm just trying to pick up some, features. Seeing he is also heavily involved in Star Trek, Voyager, Enterprise, Deep Space Nine, Next Generation. Also very exciting, and he is, is also the country. He also a book author, like New Worlds, New Civilization, and published by public books. Those things. He also co-authored the narration of Center in the Universe, a planetarium show currently running at Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles. He has written numerous magazine articles for popular science publication, including Sky Telescope, Mercury, the Journal of Materials, the Colorado Pertile Journal, and is frequently contributor to the online space forum, the Space Review. He's received PhD physics from University of Arizona and a Master in Science Technology Public Policy at George Washington University. His master's thesis, directed by Dr. John Lawson, was entitled "A Program Transition Policy Aspect of U.S. Planetary Exploration." Very, very exciting. And he's, have made several key experience in from childhood, which you can see he was very inspired, by his very special experience, from the backyard with his housemate. And it's very interesting in Milky Way and, astronomy. And he worked previously in Motorola, and he also, in the Motorola Government Electronics Division in Scottsdale, Arizona. And he also had some involvement in Apollo program. And because, this Los Angeles heavily aerospace and also, Hollywood. So he got all the best on both sides. So he has very amazing experience. So we'd like to, chat with him. So basically what will happen is André will start to, say something about himself, his experience. Well, this is basically a networking event. So you are welcome to ask questions or just treating you like chatting with him, network with the fellow attendees. So with this, let's welcome André. Yeah,
thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking with you guys tonight. I wish we could do this in person, and I hope someday we will. I'm sure that there will be a time when this pandemic is behind us and we can all start to get together again, and I look forward to that day. I don't know if I didn't quite understand you, if you had mentioned that I had worked for Motorola. It was my father who worked for the Motorola Government Electronics Division in Scottsdale, and they helped develop, and they helped develop some of the communications equipment for the Apollo missions. Motorola, as a company, started by making radios for cars, hence the name Motorola. So they had a lot of experience with long distance communication technology. Anyway, as Ken said in the introduction, I was born in Chicago, but my family moved to Phoenix when I was 7 years old. And the difference between living in Chicago and Phoenix back then was that you could actually see stars from Phoenix, from the suburbs, pretty well. In the summertime, you could actually see the Milky Way. And I was fascinated by this. And I, of course, wanted to learn the names of the brighter stars and the constellations. So I went to the my school library and I checked out books about astronomy. And pretty soon I wanted to get a telescope, and I managed to find a telescope company right here in Phoenix that made telescopes for sale to the public. And my father took me to that shop, which was run by a brilliant optician named Max Bray, and he made a kind of telescope that's sort of a hybrid of a reflector and a refractor, a catadioptric telescope, like the Maksudov Cassegrain being the example of what Max built. Max was a brilliant optician, and in fact, he did the final figuring on the optics of the Mariner 4 and 5 spacecraft. Mariner 4, of course, was the first spacecraft to fly by Mars and take close-up images back in 1965, I believe it was. Max worked on those optics for JPL. And so the first telescope I ever looked through was one of Max's little 3-inch Maksudov Cassegrains. He pointed it at Saturn, and I saw this little white disc with a little ring around it, and I literally, it took my breath away. And I couldn't believe that you could see that through such a small telescope. And later that summer, I went on a camping trip with the Boy Scouts to Oak Creek Canyon, which is near a place called Sedona that some of you might have heard of. This was back in 1970, so 50 years ago. And the skies were much darker then. And after the sun went down, me and a couple of friends of mine moved away from the campfire to get away from the light and looked up, and the Milky Way was like a solid white band of stars across the sky. And again, just breathtaking. I also, of course, had watched the first manned lunar landing. I was 10 years old when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the moon. I remember it like it was yesterday. And I loved Star Trek, which was on television at the time. I didn't really understand it, the original Star Trek. But it went into reruns by the time I was in high school, and I became a huge Star Trek fan. And there was a book that came out when I was in high school called The Making of Star Trek. And it was about how the TV show was actually made. And, I had some idea that, these are actors, of course, and they're on a set, and that set is in Hollywood somewhere, and they shoot the show, and people write scripts. But I knew nothing really beyond that about how television shows were made. But this book was all about the behind the scenes and the different people who work on the show, and the people who make the sets, and the people who design them, and why they did one thing and not another, and how hard it is to sell a TV show to a TV network, and the changes that they demanded, and all the things that happened, and behind the scenes. And it sounded so fun. I couldn't believe how interesting it all was. Also at that time, Carl Sagan was becoming popular. He'd written a book called The Cosmic Connection that I read when I was 11 or 12 years old. And I thought that book was again, amazing. So many interesting topics: white dwarfs, comets, how the solar system was formed, what are the prospects for life on Mars, how could we detect life on Mars if it's not, obvious, if it's only microbes, and all of these amazing things. So I was hooked by the time I was, 11, 12, 13 years old on astronomy, space science, space exploration. But I also loved the fictional treatments of all of those things. Not only Star Trek, but some of my favorite writers were Ray Bradbury and Robert A. Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke. I ate that stuff up as a kid. So by the time I got to college, I knew I wanted to find some way of making a living in astronomy and space science. So I, in 1977, started as a physics major at the University of Arizona. I knew that you needed a solid foundation in physics in order to become an astronomer. They did have an astronomy major, but it seemed like it was a kind of a weaker version of a physics major. So I thought, why not go for straight physics, which I did. And then I did a year of graduate work in physics. I'd intended to take a break after college. I was pretty burned out by the time I got my BS in physics. It was hard work, a lot of math and physics classes. My final semester of my senior year, I took 5 senior level math and physics classes, and I got A's in 4 of them. So I worked very hard, and I really needed a break. I took a break, and I was planning to work for a couple of years, like at a chip manufacturer. You know, this was in the early 1980s, and chip fabs were propping up everywhere. And I knew a little bit about solid state physics, and you know, had enough of a background to get like an entry level job at a place like that. But you know, it was during a recession. Not a lot of people were hiring. It was hard to get interviews, and harder still to get a job after you landed an interview. And it was a little frustrating. And so, as a backup plan, I applied to graduate school at the U of A in physics. Probably not the best idea, because I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my major. I knew it was probably going to be something to do with astronomy, but obviously there are 1,000 different things that, you know, one can pursue. I was interested in optics. They had a great optical sciences center at the U of A. In retrospect, I probably should have gone into optics, but because I really couldn't make up my mind about what I wanted to do, I thought, well, I'll just do the basic physics graduate school curriculum. And I didn't like it at all. I didn't like my teachers. I didn't like the coursework. I didn't like the textbooks. I got into some of the wrong classes because the advisors kind of really didn't care where I went and what I did. I was dropped into first year classes in graduate school that I'd only taken one semester of as a senior. And it ended up just kind of being a mess. And I just had to kind of stop and reconsider, what do I really want to do? I was also, very long story here, I won't bore you with the details, but when I was 6 years old, my grandfather bought my brother and I a piano, and I started taking piano lessons, and I was a pretty good pianist, and I loved to play just for fun. And I was taking some lessons with a guy who was getting a graduate degree in piano performance. And after a couple of lessons, he said, you know, you really ought to be studying with the guy I studied with. I thought, oh, okay. So I went and auditioned for this guy on the piano faculty, and he accepted me as a student in piano and composition. At the same time, I got a job working for Dr. Frank Lowe, who was an infrared astronomer in the astronomy department at U of A, because I didn't want to give up, you know, the prospect of doing astronomy. And Frank was perfectly happy letting me be a piano and composition major, as long as I came to the lab every morning and did the work he needed me to do, which was mostly testing JFETs, junction field effect transistors, to work on their acoustic, try to characterize their acoustic properties at very low temperatures. Because when you do infrared astronomy, you've typically got to cool the sensor down to very low temperatures, liquid nitrogen or even liquid helium temperatures. So I was good at doing lab work, so I just went in and I did my thing, and I played the piano all afternoon and did some composing. And it became clear to me that I wanted to find a way to kind of combine my interests in both the arts and the sciences. And I was a pretty good technical writer in college, and got a very encouraging recommendation from one of my physics professors based on a report I'd written. And he said, you know, there aren't a lot of people who know science reasonably well and can also write reasonably well. There's a real need for technical writers. And he said, you might want to consider that, you know, as another career path. And long story short, I got more and more involved in writing. And I started doing magazine writing. I wrote for Sky and Telescope and some other publications. And then I started taking some creative writing classes. And Star Trek: The Next Generation came on TV. And I watched it. And the first, you know, season or two worth of episodes, they weren't really very good, in my opinion. I thought, you know, I think I could come up with a better story than that. So I came up with some story ideas. I wrote a script just on my own. I you know, got a book and learned what the format was. I had a couple of friends who wrote for television, people I'd grown up with who went out to be writers on sitcoms and so forth. And they gave me some script samples and encouraged me. And I submitted a script because they allowed submissions at that time from writers who didn't have agents. And got a very polite thanks, but no thanks, encouraging enough that I thought, yeah, you know, maybe I could take a crack at this again at some point. Another very long story. In the wake of the Challenger disaster in 1986, I started learning more and more about what went on behind the scenes at NASA, especially in the transition from the Apollo era to the shuttle era, and all of the different factors that went into the decision to build the space shuttle in the configuration that we all became familiar with. And I couldn't believe the political dimensions of this, how many compromises were made for the purpose of money, saving money up front, even though they were going to increase the operational costs of the system down the road. And I'm like, how can they make decisions like that? That's ridiculous. And I started reading the name of a guy named John Logsdon, who was a space historian and ran something called the Space Policy Institute at the George Washington University. And they had a master's program in a field called Science, Technology, and Public Policy. And I thought, wow, that sounds really interesting. Here's another way to combine my interests in writing and talking about big ideas, what should be the long-term goals of the space program? How much money should it get? Why are we doing it? How should we do it? So I applied and I was accepted, and I got a NASA fellowship, which allowed me to pay for it because it was a pretty expensive program. Probably, I'm sure it still is. It's an expensive school. And I wasn't sure how I was going to get the money to do it. I was working mostly part-time back then, teaching people how to use microcomputer application software and developing an astronomy program for PCs with a company called PC Globe. So I got the fellowship in, this is now August of 1991. I moved to Washington, D.C. to pursue my master's degree in science, technology, and public policy. So, huge difference between grad school in physics and grad school at GW in the science, technology, and public policy program. Logsdon, great guy, took an immediate interest in my welfare as a student, wanted me to succeed, showed me what my options were, took extraordinarily interesting courses about the history of the space program, economics, environmental science, environmental policy. Great stuff, really fascinating. And, 2 days or so after I arrived, Logsdon was finishing, some class or something. He said, oh, hey, there's a reception at the Canadian Embassy for the first Canadian astronaut to go to go on the space shuttle. You want to come? I'm like, well, sure. So it was just fascinating, so fun to live and work in DC and to be at GW. I was still trying to pitch some stories to Star Trek: The Next Generation, which was still on TV at the time. And I knew it would be easier if I had an agent. I didn't know how you go about getting an agent. So I called one of my friends who worked in television. And he said, well, the Writers Guild has a list of agencies that will take first-time writers. And you've written a couple of scripts, so you've got some material to shop around. Contact one of these smaller agencies that's looking for new people and see if maybe somebody there wants to represent you. I thought, okay. So I sent my stuff to one agency and they passed, and then to another and they passed, and another and they passed, and da-da-da. I went to probably 9 or 10 different agencies before I finally found somebody who said, oh, I like your stuff. Yeah, I would like to represent you. Oh, okay, great. Can you get me a meeting to go pitch stories to Star Trek? She said, well, I'll work on it. Again, months went by and, she wasn't getting anywhere. And then I resolved, this was like in now February of 1993, my last semester at GW. I thought, I'm going to call this agent. Her name was Carrie Kelsey. I'm going to call her one more time. And if she still says, oh, I'm not, can't get, somehow I can't get your foot in the door or whatever, forget it. I'm just going to stop. I'll try to write short stories. I'll continue to do magazine writing. Maybe I'll get a PhD and, in public policy and, be a NASA policy wonk, find some other creative outlet. And she said, oh yeah, I faxed them some of your story ideas and they passed. I'm like, what? You didn't even tell me you were going to do that. And I'm literally about to hang up the phone. And she says, oh, but they're looking for a new science consultant. The guy who'd been doing it, who was one of her agency's clients, had been promoted to the writing staff as a staff writer. And I didn't even know they had such a thing as a science consultant. And I said, well, what's that about? Well, they need people to help with the science and technical language in their scripts and science ideas and stories. And they had this guy in Narayan Shankar who had gotten his PhD from Cornell in physics. And he really wanted to be a writer and he really impressed them. And they finally said, let's make you a writer. And now they need somebody to take his place. Again, a very long story short, I got on the phone with one of the producers, Jerry Taylor. She and I had a very nice conversation. She invited me to come to Hollywood. I was going to a planetary sciences meeting in Tucson in a few weeks. So after I finished that meeting, I drove down drove out to Los Angeles, borrowed my dad's car, and had a great meeting with them. Met all of the writers, the executive producers, and one of the executive producers had written a script for the Deep Space Nine show. It was a first or second draft, and he said, "Hey, I've written the script. It needs a lot of technical help. This is going to be your audition. I want you to read this script, write up a set of technical notes for me, and we'll see how you do." And Narain showed me the format that he used for doing his notes. I drove back to Phoenix. Again, this is in 1993, maybe April at this point. And read the script, went to the library, no internet back then, or very little in the way of really being online. Went to the library, did some research. I wrote 7 or 8 pages of notes for Michael Piller, the guy who wrote the script, faxed them to Michael the next day, and got a call a couple of weeks later when I was back in Washington, D.C., saying, from Jerry Taylor, the producer I originally talked with, and she said, "Hey, Michael really liked your notes. If you want the job, it's yours." And they needed me to start literally to the week that my NASA fellowship for my master's degree ended, May of 1993. So in May of 1993, I loaded up my car and drove from Washington, D.C. to L.A. And I figured, I'll give it a couple of years. Again, my intention was to become a writer on the show or some show. And if that didn't work out, I was still young enough. I was in my early 30s. I thought, I could always go back to GW or some other university, get a PhD, or just, try to get a policy position at JPL or some other NASA facility, or, American Physics Society or wherever, right? But, as it turned out, they liked what I was doing. Maybe 6 or 7 months after I started working for them, making sure that I got comfortable with doing my job and doing it well, and that they liked me and liked what I was doing. I asked Jerry Taylor if she would let me come pitch some story ideas, and she said, sure. And I went in, and there was one that she really liked. And I thought, oh my God, I'm home free. Well, she took it up the ladder, and Michael Piller, the head writer, passed on it, and I was crushed. And I went back a few months later and pitched 3 ideas. She didn't like any of them. And so it took another year or year and a half before I sold my first story. And then a month later, they bought another one. And then the next season, they were short of script. They were short of writers, and they needed somebody to write a script in a hurry based on somebody else's story. So Jerry said, "Would you like to take a shot at it?" And I said, "Sure." I wrote the script, and they liked it, and they changed very little of what they did. So from then on, I continued to be the science consultant, but I wrote 6 or 7 scripts for Star Trek Voyager. And then by the time Enterprise came along, I was writing a full-time writer and producer on the show. So that's, again, it was a long road, and a lot of details I have left out, but that's essentially how I ended up going from being, physics major and a guy doing space policy stuff to a writer and producer in television. And I love being at the intersection of science and science fiction. It's been great. I still help on the Orville. I get a call from Seth MacFarlane asking me, a couple of weeks ago, he called and he said, if the ship is not in one of the spiral arms of the galaxy, but between 2 spiral arms, would that look like a void? Would it just be black? And I said, well, no, it would really depend on where you look. If you're looking in the plane of the Milky Way, you will see thousands and thousands of stars, just like when you go out to a dark location here on Earth and you look up at Cygnus, well, you're looking into the Cygnus arm of the Milky Way and you see those beautiful star clouds. But if you look, 90 degrees away, you see relatively few stars. And he was like, oh, I see what you mean. I said, you got to think 3-dimensionally, And I encouraged our special effects supervisor to include a scene in the opening credits for the new season that we're doing that kind of shows that perspective, which I think will be very cool. Because on Star Trek, you just saw little dot stars. You never saw the Milky Way. It's like, we're probably most of the time traveling in the plane of the Milky Way. Why aren't we seeing the Milky Way on the view screen? Pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, so I was actually going to ask you a question about I have to in a few minutes because I have
go ahead. I'm sorry, I'm babbling already.
So but one of my questions was actually what kind of contributions you've done with the Orville. I've actually watched a number of the programs that you've been involved with, but the Orville is one of my favorites.
Well, thank you.
And one of my questions actually was, what are some of the science things that you've contributed to that, or any of the writing that you've done for that? And that partially answered my question right there.
Yeah.
But any other things that are interesting that you shared?
Yeah, I'm mostly a writer on the show.
Where they had the two-dimensional world. Were you
Yes.
involved in that one at
Very,
all?
very much. And, that was inspired almost entirely by Flatland, right? Which
Yes.
Seth had read and loved. And so we talked quite a bit about that. And there's a lot of hand waving in stories like that. We're going to expand a quantum bubble around the ship. Therefore, we can exist in this two-dimensional space without being crushed. Well, a quantum bubble, that's a fig leaf. That's pure fiction. That really doesn't mean anything, because nobody would have any idea how to do what we actually do in that episode. But there were other episodes where, we might talk about interference, with a communicator signal. So what causes interference in radio transmissions? I said, well, if they're in a canyon, if they're in a location with a lot of ferromagnetic minerals, that could cause interference. If there's a particularly active ionosphere, that might reflect a signal that you're trying to send out into space back down to the ground, depending on the frequency and blah, blah, blah. So things like that will come up. On Star Trek, a couple of examples. One of our writers needed a cool astronomical phenomenon on Star Trek Voyager that Captain Janeway, who was an astrophysicist as well as a starship captain, something that would be so compelling to her that she would want to stop and investigate. And this was back in like 1997. And I'd been reading about binary pulsars, right? Neutron stars that orbit the same point in space. Because of their density, they shed gravitational energy. And via the laws of general relativity, they will eventually spiral in and collapse and probably create a black hole, right? So Lisa Klink, the writer of that, that sounds great. Tell me more, So I filled her in on that. And then I reached out to an astronomer at Caltech named Sri Kulkarni and said, hey, we're doing this thing on the show about binary pulsars, which was his particular interest at the time in astronomy. And I said, I would love it if you could help guide us as to the visualization of this and the timing. It's like, this was simple Kepler stuff. I could probably figure out the orbits, but I'm not I'm not qualified to bring general relativity into the picture. If this is something you could help us with, I'd be thrilled. And he was more than happy to help, And things like comets, we had a situation in the first season where I don't know if you saw the episode with Charlize Theron. She was like a miner who was in a tough situation, and we had to rescue her. And we were in the writer's room trying to come up with what's a good scenario for her that would give us a ticking clock, and we need to rescue her. What kind of an environment? I thought, what if she's on a comet that's about to dive into its sun? Sun divers, they're called. We see these all the time. SOHO, the Solar Heliospheric Observatory, constantly. Well, every few weeks or something, sees a little comet dive into the sun. Happens all the time, right? So Seth thought, that's great. And I said, yeah, you've got the ticking clock. It's breaking up as it's, as all the volatiles are expanding and exploding, and, it could be really cool. And so that was a contribution. A couple of things coming up in season 3 that I can't talk about yet that are science and techie.
Looking forward.
Yeah, but mostly, I'm there as a writer, and I write with Brandon Braga, who I've known since my first year on Star Trek. He was a writer and story editor, a young writer on the show. And we became friends and collaborated on a couple of Voyager scripts. And then I worked for him on Star Trek Enterprise and then on Cosmos. And when we started the Orville, Brandon and I just started writing together. So I think we wrote 1 episode in season 1, 2 in season 2, and we wrote 4 this season. But our season got interrupted. We shot 4 episodes, and then we had to shut down because of the pandemic. And we're planning to do 11. 2 of the episodes that Brandon and I wrote have actually been shot. There were episodes 2 and 4 of the new season, but 2 of them have yet to be shot, along with 5 others. So who knows when we'll go back into production. But yeah, Seth still occasionally refers to me as the science consultant, and I'm always kind of like, writer. It's a little hard to break out of the stereotype, which is an interesting aspect of this to me. It's like, shows like ER and Grey's Anatomy and all of these medical shows, almost every one of them has an MD on the writing staff. All the legal shows have lawyers on the writing staff, Law and Order and so forth. A lot of these shows are created now by lawyers and doctors, right? And it's a little hard when you're coming from that background and writing scripts to be thought of as a writer first and somebody with a science background or medical background or whatever second. But it's fun, you know, I can't complain.
Thank you.
Sure. I can tell you one little anecdote from my first script for Star Trek Voyager. It was based on somebody else's story, another freelance writer, but none of the full-time writing staff had the time to do the script. So Jerry Taylor asked me if I'd like to try to do it, and I said sure, and I did it. And the show involved a ramshackle space station kind of out in the middle of nowhere that had some information we needed to try to cross a certain dangerous part of the galaxy on our trip to try to get home. And so I described the space station, you know, in a paragraph or two of scene direction, and talked about, you know, it's kind of broken down, it's a little rusty, there are leaking gases and fluids in places, it's very crowded, it's kind of dangerous, see a lot of shady characters and so forth. And, you know, a couple of months later, when they were getting ready to shoot the episode, they built this set, and I went down to see the set and to see the first day of shooting. And I was just like kind of floored by how elaborate it was, you know, what they had built. And I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. They built this based on, you know, 2 paragraphs that I wrote in the script. And there are all these extras in alien makeup and costumes, literally, I think about 100 of them. And the director, was a first-time director for Star Trek, a guy named Jesus Trevino. And Jesus told me that he, you know, he'd come up with little backstories for all the different aliens that the makeup people had created, right? And there were some tall, thin aliens. And he said, oh, they come from low gravity worlds and they walk in a kind of an interesting way. And this guy comes from such and such a planet, you know. And I was just like, it was so heady, you know. And they hadn't turned on this, you know, the lighting effects and the gases and fluids and stuff. While I was there, they were, you know, waiting to get ready to actually start filming. And for a brief moment, I thought I should throw one of these, you know, producer writer hissy fits and where are my leaking gases and fluids? Get Rick Berman down here right now. So you got to watch. I'm lucky that I got success later in life, because otherwise I might have been a little bit of a pain in the rear. Uh-oh, you got a kitten. Kitten alert. My father adopted a couple of kittens. Here's one of them. They're very curious little characters.
So cute.
Yes, and they've been walking around my dad's home office here as I've been doing the Zoom.
Yeah. For this, do they give you some inspiration for your writing? Space cat or something.
You know, Seth is a big cat fan, and Seth has 2 cats at home, Hank and Helix, and so we talk about cats quite a bit. And we joke about, yes, we have to do our cat episode one of these days, cats in space. We did do a line about Gordon, the pilot, at one point in the scene. It's just sort of a little throwaway thing where Gordon says, can we get a cat on the bridge? Cat? Yeah, I think it'd be nice, you know, have something here, just have a cat on the bridge, you know, calm people down, make people happy to see the cat. But no, I've not come up with a good feline story. What's everybody drinking tonight? I have a glass of Cote d'Aron. This is a happy hour. I see Paula has something that looks like maybe scotch.
Rosé.
Rosé. Oh, very nice. Very
I've
nice.
got water.
All right. Well, that's okay. Water's fine.
Yeah, me too. Some tea.
Tea, good.
So as long as you got me going, I came on late, and I'm probably going to have to leave early because I'm on the East Coast,
Oh.
where it's getting to be late. But I'm currently writing a novel. I worked at NASA headquarters in
Oh, neat.
Washington
Uh-huh.
for many years, and I worked for Boeing in the space division.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm writing a novel about Mars
Yeah.
and the first 50 years. It's called On Mars, the First 50 Years,
Uh-huh.
2030 to 50.
Oh, that's great.
So it's certainly fiction, but it's reality based to the
Right.
extent possible.
Yeah.
And I'm also trying to make it, I don't think of it so much as science fiction because I'm trying to make it as realistic as possible.
Right.
And I want to attract a readership that is not in the space community, and
Uh-huh.
a readership that can learn something about it.
Right.
And so I don't know, any advice?
Yeah, well, have you written fiction before?
No,
So this is your
I've,
first?
fiction, right.
Yeah.
So I was writing at NASA.
Yes.
That's what I did. I wrote reports and studies. I
That's
wrote a lot of proposals that went to the White House for funding.
right.
And then at Boeing, I was head of communications for the space division.
Oh, nice.
And for a couple of years, I was doing all of the writing about the space station
Hmm.
for the space station people.
Right.
It's crazy. I did everything. They just kept throwing things at me. But I'm
That's,
not a scientist.
yeah.
And my degree was in broadcast and film production,
Oh,
actually.
great. Wow.
So just any thoughts about creating the story or writing? I would love, once I get this thing finished,
Uh-huh.
I would love to have it on a film.
Yeah.
I mean, because I'm taking it very seriously. It's really about how I want it to be on Mars. I don't want
Uh-huh.
it terraformed.
Right.
I want to have respect for Mars and not screw up that planet as
Yeah.
we've already screwed up Earth.
Yes.
A lot of serious stuff like that. I'm not
Well,
going to get into it seriously, but
yeah.
I'm trying to just give very positive, productive
Yes.
messaging.
Well, that's great because what you've just told me right out of the box is that you've already got a point of view.
Oh,
And,
I do,
and that's
definitely.
the most important thing, I think, when you're sitting down to write something like this. And I would also tell you that all of the writing that you've done is great experience and great practice for what you're about to do.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
the
I'm doing
line
it now.
between,
I'm in
yeah,
it.
yeah.
Literally.
And you know, the line between fiction and nonfiction, you know, is much more blurred than it was previous generations. And, you know, I used to kid John Logston, my thesis advisor at
I
GW.
know John very well.
Oh, you do? Oh, great.
Oh my
I,
God.
John's a great friend. We see each other pretty regularly, at least before COVID we did. But I used to joke with John that, you know, writing policy papers was good preparation for writing fiction. And I was only half kidding because you have to, you know, you have to develop a strong narrative. And if you're trying to advocate, if you're writing a proposal to try to get something funded, you have to be an advocate and you have to be able to, you know, tell them why this is good and why it's important. And you have to be able to knock down the naysayers. And in a
Exactly.
novel, well,
This
those are
is why
just two different
NASA
characters.
kept throwing these things at me.
Yeah,
I mean, they would just keep coming at me. We need you to write this. It's
right.
going to get to the White House by the end of the week.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, and
Well,
it's
that
because
kind of pressure makes diamonds, as we like
oh
to
my
say.
God. Many,
I would say one other piece of advice is try to be very visual in your writing,
yes,
engage the reader's mind's eye. I think it was Edith Wharton who once said that every page of a novel should engage one of the writer's five senses, or maybe all five of them at least once on the page. Sense of smell, sense of touch, uh, sounds and sights and feelings, tactile feelings. That's that's a really great writing device that is unique to fiction, I'd say. Um, and you have to think about your characters. What are their values? What are their points of view? What do they want? You know, it's always about conflict. You know, you get your character chased up a tree. You have the antagonist throw rocks at the character, and then the character figures out how to get down out of the tree. That's the structure of pretty much every story that's been written since time immemorial.
I think more than that, in this story, it's much more about survival.
Yeah.
Because these are the first people living on
Yeah.
Mars. And they're all scientists. It's
Yeah.
a scientific community. It's not commercialized.
Yeah.
It's
That's great.
science.
Well, when you say that, you know, you should read, if you haven't already, or if you haven't recently, read some Jack London, you know, read some of his survival tales. Get yourself steeped in that kind of literature. That will be very helpful for you. See how other writers have addressed the subject of surviving in a harsh environment.
And mentally too.
Yeah, mentally and physically, and you know, socially. You know, there's a lot of work, of course, that's been done at NASA and other institutions over the years about extreme environments and how small groups either thrive or fall apart in extreme environments. I mean, I helped put together a study that we did at GW with Rusty Schweikert, who was an astronaut on Apollo 9, and some other, we had a surgeon from a nuclear submarine and various other people who talked about what are the challenges, what are the things that you have to know up front before you start designing hardware about a small group of people living in an extreme environment where help is not immediately available. And, you know, some of these analog studies, you know, these Mars habitats that they built on,
they
you
have
know,
many of them now they have many around the world. I'm amazed.
Yeah.
I keep learning about more. I just heard that Israel has one. I mean,
oh, really? Wow.
They're everywhere. I know. It's really growing, and this is going to be very international.
Yeah.
And I can already see the international energy growing in reality.
Well, read those studies and incorporate them into your work, you know. And there's nothing that says in your novel that you cannot, you know, do a digression. And I think people who read what we call hard science fiction, stuff that's really based in reality, things that could happen in the near future, those writers, you know, like Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke and Larry Niven and Jerry Purnell and Greg Benford, who's a friend of mine, David Brin.
I know a lot of these names.
Yeah. You know, they will do these interesting digressions to talk about some
digression.
Oh, just like you're in a scene and there's some conflict between two characters, and maybe that conflict has to do about whether or not a soil sample should be brought into the habitat. I don't know. I'm just pulling that out of the hat. Then you can spend a few paragraphs or a few pages talking about the soil of Mars. What's different about, or I should say regolith. Soil has microbial components. Regolith is just dirt and rock.
Right.
You know, what is different about the Martian regolith? Oh, there are these chemicals called perchlorates. They're extremely toxic. They do X, Y, and Z. Go ahead and talk about that for a few pages. Make it a little, you know, a little high school science treatise or whatever, you know, whatever level you're writing to. And that's perfectly fine, you know. There are no rules about that. Some writers.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I want to capture people's attention and interest in going to Mars.
Yeah.
I also do want to teach them some things on a light level. You know, I don't want to get too deep.
Right.
But I want to keep them interested. But you made some really good points. You must have read the book, The Martian?
Yes, of course.
And he gets with the potatoes and everything.
Yeah, the potatoes.
I mean, you know.
Yeah, he gets into the details. Well,
book.
Yeah. And if you haven't read it already, Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars. That's a great model. He does what I've just described in terms of, you know, he really gets into the nitty gritty and the details, and he has interesting characters. He gets into the politics, he gets into the science of terraforming, the morality, the ethics. You know, there is a faction that says, you know, don't change a thing on this planet. Mars is perfect and beautiful the way it is. Another faction that says, this world is dead. We have the opportunity to bring it alive, and we have an ethical obligation to terraform this world and to bring life to another place in an otherwise cold and lonely universe, you know. So, and it's always great, you know, the best conflict. My last piece of advice, I promise.
Oh, no, I'm okay.
the
don't know
most
about everybody
interesting,
else.
the most interesting conflicts in fiction are not right versus wrong. They are right versus right. I understand both sides of that argument. Leaving Mars exactly the way it is, pristine, learning as much about it before you start screwing it up. God forbid, I personally don't think we should send humans to the surface of Mars until we've brought back multiple samples from multiple sites and understand what's there that we might screw up just by our presence, right?
Right. I mean, we've already put rovers on
We've
there.
already put rovers down there, which is dangerous, but humans is a whole nother ballpark because, you've got a microbiome and there's no way you can leave that behind on Earth, right? So, but I also understand, hey, if we could terraform Mars, if we could, release the CO2 in the polar caps and thicken the atmosphere, should we do that? I don't know if we should or we shouldn't, but I could be persuaded, I bet.
I'm so opposed to that.
Good.
I'm not going to write about being opposed to it. I just don't even want to talk
Well,
about
right.
it.
Well, okay.
I mean,
Whatever you want to do.
I might, have a address it in some way, but
Well, if you have a protagonist who is pro Mars, Mars the way it is, that protagonist will become more interesting if there are opposing forces who say to her, no, we don't want it the way it is. We think it's a waste the way it is. And here's how we're going to try to change it. You know what I'm saying? She can maintain her point of view. She doesn't have to be, won over by any means. But you want to see forces in opposition.
that's great input, really.
Good.
It's the first time I've ever really told anybody about what I'm writing.
Well, congratulations and good for you for doing it. That takes a lot of courage. Good for you. That takes a lot of courage. Good for you.
Well, I've had so much experience with all of this.
Yeah.
And I got interested in space when the Russians launched Sputnik.
Oh, wow.
And I went out and looked in the sky.
Yeah,
I was 10 years old.
Wow.
And so, I mean, I've been a space cadet most of my life.
Sure.
And so, I'm just really interested in all this.
Yeah.
But I'm also worried about things that we might do. I mean, we're already so screwed up Earth. I just don't want us to go to another planet and screw up another planet.
I completely agree with you. Yeah. Yeah. And I fear that we might, but, I'd say that, I tend to be more optimistic in the long run, pessimistic maybe in the short run, but I think in the long run, we've got a great future ahead. And I do hope that, that we treat Mars with much greater respect than we've treated the Earth these last few decades.
Hopefully we take those lessons learned.
Yeah.
One thing that comes up in that context is that's a really good argument for the O'Neill type of structure, where we don't really live on one of the existing planets, but in fact construct our worlds out there, which is easy to say, not too easy to do, and you still have to get your raw materials from someplace.
Well, I think
the asteroid belt, perhaps.
Building an O'Neill habitat, to me, I think, in my mind, that's infinitely easier than terraforming Mars or any other planet.
Well, at least you can build it to your own specs. Nature didn't favor us too much in that regard.
And we at least understand the engineering requirements of something like that. I don't think anybody really knows how to terraform a planet like Mars. I mean, you can talk about, if we could just liberate all the CO2 from the polar caps. Well,
Elon Musk, that's what he wants to do.
Yeah, well.
and then what? That's always the question. And then what?
Yeah, then what? Yeah.
But isn't that already in the Total Recall, the movie, Arnold Schwarzenegger?
Yes, that was part of the story. Yes.
What was it called? The Total
Recall. Yeah, Arnold Schwarzenegger movie based on a Philip K. Dick story, and some aliens had apparently built an infrastructure for terraforming Mars buried beneath the surface that they had abandoned, or they died out before they could put their plans into motion. And Arnold Schwarzenegger manages to discover this and figure out how to do it and save the day. It's an interesting movie. It's very violent. It's it's unconvincing on a scientific and technical level, but it's kind of intended to be, I think. because there's a question of whether this is all happening in the Schwarzenegger character's mind as opposed to really happening on Mars. It's fun, you know. I would warn you ahead of time about the violence, just because, you know, some people are sensitive to that, and but it would be interesting to watch. And my friend Bob Picardo is in it. He has a small part as an android taxi cab driver, which is pretty funny.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, it was one of his first movie roles. And is that the Jim French I corresponded with recently on our?
That is the very same Jim French.
Very nice to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you, sir.
Yeah, thanks for joining in tonight.
My pleasure. Sorry it took so long to get hooked up. My computer was being cranky, I guess.
I get it. I've had those problems.
Yeah, well, haven't we all?
Yeah.
But it was good. You know, your point that I was taken with was the business about right versus right, because nobody ever, at least admittedly, assumed a position because I know this is wrong and evil and I want to do it that way.
Exactly.
It's because I am right, and so those other guys are wrong.
Right.
And the real conflict comes in, of course, when maybe you start to realize they do have a point.
Yeah.
And you know, it's really the human conflict. If you're perceptive enough to realize that the other guys have some logic on their side, then it starts to get really sticky. I don't think I'd be a good enough writer to deal with that, but that's going to be one of the real life things that we run into.
Yes, I agree.
Unlike politicians on Earth, all of whom are absolutely right, no matter how much they disagree with one another.
In their own minds, yeah.
Very timely.
Well, a great
Comfortable
example
in their own minds.
You know, a great example of that, of course, is, you know, the ethical issues surrounding CRISPR technology. You know, we have this extraordinary tool now to edit genes within cells.
Yeah.
And do it on a scale that will make a difference to an entire organism. And wow, what an amazing technology. You know,
Well, that immediately leads you to the concept of, let us say we did colonize Mars and perhaps other places. You can modify the humans that go there to make them more compatible
exactly
with the environment. This is probably more likely scenario on an exoplanet, but
yeah,
you know, let's say you have an exoplanet where it's deficient in certain minerals. Well, maybe you screw around with the genetics to make people compatible with that. But then they're not entirely exactly human anymore.
Yeah,
they can't come back to Earth. You can't go home again.
I wrote a story for Star Trek Voyager that was kind of based on that premise, where we encountered a planet that had something we needed, dilithium crystals or something, but it was such an inhospitable surface that even in environment suits, we wouldn't last long down on the surface of this planet. And so my premise was that, well, we've got this Borg character, 7 of 9, who has this cybernetic technology that can be modified. We could modify her to survive on this planet for the amount of time we needed to get the stuff back. And that story was turned into something pretty different by the time they got done with it. But I've always been, I called it bioforming or something like that, terraforming. Not an original idea with me by any means. There was a great science fiction short story that was written probably in the 50s, and I wish I could remember who wrote it, maybe Clifford Simak or somebody like that, about a base on Jupiter. He assumed that there was a solid core down there in the depths of the Jovian atmosphere. There was a human base there, and it was all hermetically sealed because the environment was so toxic that, you know, humans could not go out into it. But they had a machine for terraforming or for bioforming, changing people into a form that would be compatible with this Jovian environment. And it worked, and they sent people out, but the people never came back. And it was this great mystery. And it was just what we discovered at the end of the story is that it was so amazing to be a Jovian. There were all of these senses and sensations, and it was beautiful beyond anything that human minds could imagine, because they had a greater, you know, spectrum of vision and so forth. And so when people went through this process, at first they were anxious and, oh my God, what's going to happen? And then they get out there and it's like they've died and they've gone to heaven.
Stoned.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's fascinating too. I like the idea. Modify the people, don't modify the planet.
That might
agree.
be the secret.
Yeah.
We don't own these planets, you know.
No,
I don't
not at
feel
all.
that we have the right to change them.
Yeah, I think we should be very humble, you know, and for a lot of reasons, one of which, you know, the most compelling of which most scientists, I think, understand, certainly people involved in planetary protection, is, you know, if you start mucking around down there too much and you find, oh my God, look at this, we've discovered a microorganism. Well, if that microorganism happens to have the same DNA that we find here on Earth, how do you know it's not something that you brought down to the surface and contaminated the surface with? It maybe kind of looks different because it's mutated by virtue of, you know, being exposed to this environment for some period of time. But how do we know we didn't bring it with us and contaminate the surface? You know, if it's totally different chemistry, then I think we're safe in saying this is.
It's a very big issue. I'm on a couple of committees under the UN, COSPAR and
Yeah, right.
so forth. And we're discussing issues like this about contamination,
Yeah.
both contaminating the moon or Mars or
Right.
Mars, as well as getting contaminated, and trying to set up rules and regulations about how to proceed. It's very interesting because it's international, and it's many different kinds of conversations. Some of them are legal and some of them are scientific. And
there's the whole issue of resources and who owns the resources. You know, I know they're doing this Artemis Treaty now, and I know that, you know, it's been pretty well understood that, you know, since the Outer Space Treaty in '67 or whenever that was signed, that if you go to the moon or some other heavenly body and you look around and you dig up some samples and you bring them home, you're entitled to, you know, to those samples. You're not entitled to claim a territory.
right.
But suppose we, you know, start landing astronauts down at the South Pole of the moon where there are these cold traps, and now it seems more clear than ever that there is a lot of ice down there, and that's
Right.
obviously an
that's
extraordinarily
gonna
useful
really be
resource.
the target in the
Yeah,
beginning.
but who owns that? You know, is it just whoever can get it owns it?
That's the way history has worked out in the
That is
past,
the way
and
history
I
has
suspect
worked out,
it will
for
again.
sure.
But it's really, I mean, we have to deal with this even in our environment of, you know, all the space around Earth. We have
Yeah.
so many satellites up there and moving
Yeah.
pieces.
Right.
The astronauts are complaining that they can't get through.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, we're really not paying attention to the results of our actions.
No, we're not policing it very well.
We never do.
What I learned when I was at GW, a concept called the tragedy of the commons, right? If you've got one well that has fresh water, that's, you know, the sole source of fresh water for an entire town, who owns that water? Well, we would like to think it's a public resource. Well, how are you going to enforce that? Well, you got to have police and so on and so forth. Low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, geosynchronous orbit, I think should be thought of as a resource for the world, not just for the people who have the money and the means to put up satellites.
Absolutely.
And I worry a little about Elon Musk's, you know, Starlink program.
I do
For
too.
that very reason.
This is exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Every time I see somebody launching 60 or 80 satellites at once, the first thing that comes into mind is debris.
Yep. Absolutely.
Debris and collisions. I mean,
Yeah.
it's I can't.
Well, and you know, eventually something will happen and there will be a domino effect. I mean, what it was like 20 years ago that a Russian satellite, the decommissioned Russian satellite, literally collided with another satellite on an intersecting orbit. I mean, that's if that's not a wake-up call, I don't know what is. You know.
Yeah, indeed.
We have to find some mitigation techniques, and there's really.
And we have no control over these things. They're out of fuel, and they're just, you know.
Well, we live in interesting times.
Oh, don't we? Yes.
Yeah,
the Chinese curse. Yes.
back in 2009, NASA and DARPA issued a request for information for orbital debris removal, and I was with Boeing at the time, and we submitted a couple of concepts. NASA and DARPA, they called it Catcher's Mitt, so you might remember it under that name. And oddly enough, a lot of the concepts were not necessarily catcher's mitts. So like a big blob of aerogel, that's one thing. Or you could, like zap some of the smaller debris with a laser, and the ablation of some of the material will cause the orbit to decay. But one legal expert pointed out the problem there is once you touch something, whoever is the last entity to touch it is now liable. So if you reduce its lifetime from 40 years to 5 years, but in that 5 years, the trajectory hits someone who it might not otherwise hit, you are liable. So there's a lot of legalities that have to be sorted out if we're even going to have a way to clean up the debris.
Oh, absolutely. Now you raise a really good point. And, I don't know that that's necessarily wrong,
Oh yeah,
if you have good intentions, good intentions sometimes lead to bad outcomes. So
yeah, and so there's right now the MIL standard on satellite lifetime in low Earth orbit is you have to either have a plan to dispose it there's this graveyard in the South Atlantic where not too many ships go, or you have to prove that its natural lifetime once its fuel is spent is no greater than 25 years. And there's a lot of talk that's saying that the 25-year limit that may be too much. We might not want stuff flying
because
around.
we're making so many advancements.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just wearing out all your fuel, but it's also disposing, because now we've got this bigger and better satellite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the bigger things for years now, I guess, have been designed for deorbit, right? Unless they're in geosynchronous orbit, in which case you don't really need to worry about them, plunging into the atmosphere anytime soon.
But you're only one malfunction away from it becoming a permanent object in space.
Yes.
Right.
And then what do you do?
Yeah. And, there are only so many slots in geosynchronous orbit, and they're obviously a precious commodity.
Have you seen some of those maps that show the Earth and then all the stuff around it?
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean, you can hardly
Crazy.
see the Earth.
It's scary. Well, the scale is exaggerated, of course, but still, it's a whole bunch of stuff out there.
Yeah.
Well, interesting problems to have, that's for sure. So I know Jim, and I know a little bit now about Paula, and Seth, you just joined the conversation. What do you do and where do you work?
Well, I was with Boeing for many years. I'm now
with Boeing.
Actually, funny you should ask. I went from Downey to Seal Beach to Huntington Beach to Seal Beach, back and forth a few times. They shut Downey down, so we had to move. And then I spent my last 5 years there in El Segundo at the Satellite Development Center. And then for the past couple of years, I've been an independent consultant, mostly working with Naval Research Lab and a small spin-up company a friend of mine started in the DC area. So I have to say, like my bosses and I both have a view of the water, but theirs is the Potomac River and mine is the Pacific Ocean. So that's the nice thing about being virtual.
Are you a systems engineer, or what is your?
Yeah, my job title is systems engineer, and I was a systems engineer in the old sense of the word, of more of a system designer, trades and analysis, and kind of top level system design. See a project through to about preliminary design review. Then I move on to the next capture.
Okay.
And by the way, shameless plug time. The reason I'm logging in late was I had a conflicting event with the National Space Society, and I'm president of the LA chapter. So,
oh, great.
In fact, André, I think there was the National Space Society chapter, in conjunction with a bunch of other organizations, about 22 years ago, when I first moved to California, hosted an event at Caltech at which you spoke. And I remember hearing you speak, and you had some memorable stories about having to provide reasonable, feasible sounding technobabble for Pharaoh, and how actually she had trouble pronouncing the words, and she's a rather tall, statuesque woman. And,
yes, indeed.
but Andre, forgive me for saying this, but my first thought in hearing that is, yes, Terry, but when considering how much Andre gets paid for writing the words versus how much you get paid for saying, I think you can cut him a little slack. I hope you don't mind my pointing that out.
And she did. She's a lovely woman, I have to say. But yeah, no, I've been a longtime NSS member and supporter, and met. Oh God, I know I'm blanking on his name now. Hansen, who founded one of the founders of the L5 Society.
Oh, I think I know who you mean, and I'm blanking too.
Down in Tucson, I met him when I was at the U of A.
Keith Henson, yeah.
Keith Henson.
Yeah, I think he's either in San Diego or in LA now. I talk to him once in a while, and he's still active in a couple of these organizations.
Yeah.
In fact, you might, once we get back to normal, if we ever do, you probably cross paths with him again, because he does go to a lot of science fiction conventions.
Yeah, I haven't seen him in years, but I figured he was still around. I'd seen his name here and there over the years, and and obviously I've known Bob Zubrin for many years, and good friends with Lou Friedman, co-founder of the Planetary Society with Carl Sagan and Bruce Murray. I knew Bruce Murray pretty well when he was alive, and so yeah.
Hey, Andre, have you ever crossed paths with Gerard O'Neill?
Never met him, no.
Oh.
Read The High Frontier, of course, when I was in college, and was a huge fan. Sadly, I never got to meet him.
He because between the NSS event that we just had was a kind of about a meta study about the feasibility of space colonization, and I remember years ago, Jerry O'Neill's Space Studies Institute continued on after his passing. It still exists. I don't think they have regular conferences so much, but they actually had a debate at one of their conferences. It was planned to be Friedman versus Friedman, with George Friedman of USC, who was then the president of the Space Studies Institute, and Lou Friedman, debating what's like the best next step. Is it for settlement? Is it colonies in free space versus Mars?
Right.
And Lou Friedman couldn't make it, so it was just George talking about O'Neill.
Too bad, because Lou's obviously a hardcore Mars guy.
Yeah,
Oh,
but the planetary protection issue throws another kind of monkey wrench into that. And I'm revealing my bias, but it tilts the balance toward habitats in free space, because basically you can have, I like them because you can have any gravity you want, and at any size you want, any atmosphere you want, and you can optimize for humans and have a section that's agricultural. In Mars, you're stuck with a slightly longer day, toxic stuff in the soil and so on.
Right. Yeah, Jim was mentioning that earlier, and one person I did meet who was a notable figure in this world, and in fact, it was at this planetary science conference I went to in Tucson in 1993, which that I went to before I made my trip to Hollywood to do my interview for Star Trek, was Freeman Dyson. And I got to meet and talk with Freeman Dyson, who was, totally fascinating and charming. And I've always loved his writing and his thinking. He's such an he was sadly passed away earlier this year, but lived to a ripe old age. And that was a thrill getting to meet Freeman.
He was a cool guy. I crossed paths with him a few times, and he just can talk on so many subjects and informed, and
a real polymath.
Yeah.
And proud of the fact that he never got a PhD.
I've always been proud of that too.
Personally, that gave me great comfort. Having felt a little, maybe I should have gotten a PhD.
Would anybody like to hear a slightly amusing story about the Planetary Society and Bruce and Carl and Lou?
Yeah.
At the time that all came to pass, I was the advanced studies manager at JPL. So I lived up in the big building there, a floor or so down from Bruce Murray, who was the director.
Right.
And periodically, Carl would come to town, and Friedman worked there. In fact, he was my boss.
Yeah.
So I noticed that almost every time Carl came to town, I would see the three of them sitting out in the parking lot behind Building 180 in this elderly Volvo that Carl or that Bruce drove. He had one of the old ones that looked sort of like a 1939 Ford.
Right.
But anyway, they would be sitting out there in the car for hours talking, and I thought, this is really weird. What are those guys up to? And I kept watching, noticed that every time they came to town, they were sitting out there.
Yeah.
Something weird is going on. Well,
Cooking
anyway,
up GPS.
so exactly. So some months after some months of that, all of a sudden the word leaked out, or was brought out that the Planetary Society was forming.
Yeah.
And I raced up to Friedman's office and said, "Sign me up. I want to be the first member."
Oh,
And he said, and I said, "How much is it?" He said, $15. So I whipped out $15 and gave it to him. So I am officially and actually recognized as the very first paying member of the Planetary Society.
Wow, that's awesome.
And
Congratulations.
thank you. Lou was talking about that one time. He says, "I actually don't know what I did with Jim's $15. I probably went out and had lunch with it." But at least he had the decency to remember and put me on the list.
40 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've done a lot of stuff for them over the years. After I joined, I don't know, back in the 80s at some point, and then when I moved to Los Angeles in 1993, the Star Trek science consultant job didn't pay me enough money to make ends meet. So of course it was only a part-time job, and I had to find some other part-time work. So I did some freelance magazine writing, and I worked one day a week at the San Juan Institute, which is a lunar and planetary laboratory down in San Juan Capistrano.
Oh.
A guy named Doug Nash, who was a geochemist at JPL, lived in San Juan Capistrano, and he got tired of the commute. And he had the grant money, and he found a bank building that had been, it was on, it was being sold. And it had a safe, and that attracted Doug because he had a bunch of Apollo lunar samples that he was still analyzing. And so he made the pitch to NASA and to JPL and said, "Hey, I want to set up my own lab down in San Juan Capistrano. I'll hire a postdoc. I'll do this, do that. They got a safe for the lunar samples, I have microscopes, a spectroscope, whatever I need." So he started this institute, and I went to a meeting there when I was doing my master's degree. And that's how I found out about the place. I met Doug and liked him. And so when I moved down, I got in touch with him and I said, "Hey, I'm here, and if there's anything I can do." And he said, "Hey, I need somebody to come down once a week to help me write proposals to NASA headquarters and to help me with the education program that we're doing." Because they would invite school kids in and make a comet, out of CO2 and dirt and whatever. And so I, for 3 or 4 years, probably, commuted one day a week, the 60 miles down to San Juan Capistrano to work there and try to help Doug get money and, and work on the education program. And one of his postdocs was Bruce Betts, who was a student of Bruce Murray. And Bruce Betts eventually went to the Planetary Society and is now their director of research, PhD, planetary scientist. Great guy. Really like Bruce a lot.
Hey, speaking of all these objects, tonight Mars and the moon and the full moon ought to be very close together. I haven't been out to look.
Correct.
Should be a pretty spectacular sight.
Yeah, I have it.
Because it's going to be really the second full moon. It's the blue moon.
Yes.
Oh, that
Halloween.
too.
I have a 10-inch Cassegrain reflector at home, and I've gotten some great views of Mars, this opposition. I want to try to do I have a high-speed video camera, and I've got software that can, go through all of the frames, pick out the sharpest ones, right, from when the seeing just happens to be just right, and then assemble those images. And and get a nice sharp image with very low signal to a very good signal to noise ratio. But we just haven't had the time, and the seeing has been kind of bad in LA anyway. But I
Have
love
you had a lot of smoke?
smoke from the fires, yeah, and then just the weird high pressure, low pressure systems. You get a nice high pressure system, and you get a couple of nights of good seeing. I live 3 miles from the Pacific Ocean, so even though I'm in the city, I can get really good seeing conditions in LA from time to time. But it's just been kind of a crappy year weather-wise, and but I still love looking through telescopes. And I have that 10-inch Takahashi Muon. It's a Dal Kirkham system, if that means anything to you. Great optic, great piece of equipment, and I still have several telescopes from Max Bray, the guy who made the telescope that I first ever looked through when I was 11 years old. He was a brilliant optician, and I have several of his Maksutov Cassegrains. Max could grind polish a spherical surface to a 50th of a wave. So I have telescopes that, at the focal plane, they're probably 30th wave instruments. Really, really good.
Andrew, if you took some photos, that's posted on the AIAA newsletter.
Oh, great.
Again.
Great.
Yeah.
And
And
so
Robert
what is
here.
this we're seeing?
Sorry?
What is this image?
Oh, this Earth
It's
image?
a virtual background.
Oh, looks like Europe. I see Italy and Spain.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to figure out.
And my father's homeland of Latvia. My dad grew up in Riga, Latvia, till Stalin decided he wanted to live there. It's on the Baltic. If I had a pointer, I could kind of point it out, but not very. I've never actually been there. My dad went back for the first time in 45 years.
If you look closely, you can make out the peninsula where Norway and Sweden are. So it's on the other side of that little body of water from them.
That's right.
Andrew,
André.
Robert is here. Yeah.
I was just going to say hello. Hi, André. My name's Robert.
Hi, Robert.
My wife and I discovered the show during the pandemic. I'd heard about it maybe a few months earlier in the fall from a former colleague of mine who's works at a space company. And it took the pandemic for us to start getting into it, and we just. And then at first it was like I wanted to watch it. Then every night my wife's like, "No, we got to watch another episode."
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, I'm sorry it took the pandemic to get you to like the show.
Whatever works.
Yeah, right. I'm glad you're enjoying it. One of the funny things about the show, of course, is that Fox marketed it as this Spaceballs, straight comedy kind of a thing, which Seth never intended. And I think people were a little surprised when we did these more sort of dramatic, high concept science fiction episodes. But Seth has always wanted it to be, a show like Star Trek, the original, and Star Trek: The Next Generation, optimistic, forward-looking, single episode, high concept science fiction. And, I always knew Seth was extremely funny, a great mimic, a very good half-hour comedy writer. I had no idea what a good 1-hour drama writer he is, what a good science fiction writer he is. And, he writes half of the episodes. He stars in them. He directs half of them. He's 46 years old, and he's the most amazingly prolific and hardworking person I have ever known, bar none. I mean, maybe Buzz Aldrin in the 60s, but I got to tell you, it's astonishing that he's also, he's a musician, he's a singer, plays the piano, he's recorded albums. We were in the writer's room. I'm sorry, Seth MacFarlane. We were in the writer's room one afternoon a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. And mid-afternoon, Seth was like, looked at his watch. Oh, we got a break. I have to leave early today. Oh, what's going on? He said, I'm going downtown. Downtown? What are you doing there? Well, Barbra Streisand is doing a concert, and she asked me to come do a couple of duets with her. Okay. Yeah, all right, I get it. So and he's just the nicest guy in the world. He came from humble beginnings. Both of his parents were, school teachers, school administrators. He grew up in a suburb of Boston and never had money really growing up, but he loved Star Trek. He loved music and old show tunes, and and Frank Sinatra, which is unusual for somebody his age, you know, growing up when he did. And he and his dad, there was some company that had thrown out a bunch of cardboard boxes, big, huge, you know, 6-foot type things. He and his dad drove over there and took as many as they could and packed them into the car. And in the attic of his house, he built a little section of the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, used Christmas lights and all this other stuff, painted. He made uniforms, him and his friends. He made his own fan film when he was like 15 years old or something.
Oh my God.
And, you know, I mean, that in and of itself, you know, for somebody that age to go to those lengths.
I couldn't do it.
Yeah, I couldn't either. Demonstrates a certain level of dedication.
It does.
And energy, you know. And I think like a lot of successful people, and I mentioned this in my little biography for this event tonight, that I'm doing kind of the same things that I did 50 years ago when I was a kid, you know, building model spaceships out of Lego and making my little Lego astronauts, you know, and robots. And I had airlocks, I had landing ramps, I had star fields that I made by punching holes with needles and black cardboard and backlighting it to put in front of the viewports of the ship. And, you know, and I had little alien landscapes I built here in my parents' backyard, you know, with model train kit lichen. And then I would tear up pieces of, you know, sponge and spray painted black to make it look like igneous rocks. Just, that was my thing, you know, and I made up little stories, you know, and to be able to do as an adult what you love doing as a kid, and to be able to do that as a living is a real privilege, you know. And I have to say, I feel very blessed or fortunate that, you know, that I can still do this stuff at my age. And I hope I'm able to do it for a few more years, you know.
That's the way I feel about my career. I've been having
TV,
fun for 60 some odd years.
Yeah, I'm 61, and, you know, TV is an industry that is still very much geared toward youth. I'm lucky that I found a place with Seth, you know, on his show, and on Cosmos, which he also executive produces, which, again, you know, loved Carl Sagan growing up as a kid. Was so thrilled to be able to work with his widow Ann on the new seasons of Cosmos. And you know, if all goes well, I can keep doing this for a few more years. And as my writing partner and friend Brandon Braga said, if we're lucky, we can sail this starship into the sunset. And then I'll go back to writing books.
An admirable ambition.
Yeah.
Hey, André, by any chance, have you seen the film The Wandering Earth?
Yes. Remind me the premise.
The Chinese
of that.
film?
Oh, the 16.
It's the Chinese film where Earth is going to go supernova.
That's right.
Yeah.
I've not seen the film, but I read the book.
So they made a film version. It's not like the best film,
right.
But I think it's important for people in the West to see, because it became, like, within 2 months, the third highest grossing film ever in China.
Right.
And the film is really it's Chinese propaganda. And one of the big messages of the film is that their society uses engineering over magic. It's almost like a dig on, like, Marvel types of films to solve intractable issues, and that China is a spacefaring nation. That's where its destination is. And I wish more people in the West, you know, are kind of exposed to this, because as much as, like, we're discussing things like, you know, planetary protection stuff, in China, they just have, I think they have just a very different perspective on everything, because it's just more long term. You know, we can barely think in terms of quarters, let alone decades.
They do their 5-year plans.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I know the writer. I mean, don't know him personally, but I've read his work, and I'm very impressed with him as a writer. And there are some other novels of his that are being adapted, I know, here in the United States, I think. He's a very good, very interesting writer. Well worth reading. I think Shashwin Liu, I believe is how you say his name. Cixinliu.
I'm going to have to bail out, guys, so I'm going to pull the plug. This has been really great. I've
Great to see you, Jim. Yeah, very nice to video meet you, and I hope we meet in real life sometime soon, and that we can do one of these happy hours at an appropriate bar or restaurant when this is all behind us.
Sounds fine to me. Meanwhile, let's keep in touch. If anything crops up,
absolutely
maybe we can work on it. Cool.
Yeah, me too.
All right.
And it's been so nice meeting you, really.
You too, Paul.
Same here. All of you. All right. I will see you sometime, I hope. Take care.
You're based in LA, you said?
I am. I live in West Los Angeles, near UCLA and just outside of Santa Monica.
Oh, I'm right by you. I mean, Andre, I'm over in Santa Monica.
Oh, great. And you
Yeah.
know, I've heard of your book, Robert.
Oh.
I must have seen it like in NSS or on some website or something.
Could be, yeah. It just came out
Did-
last month. It's my first crack at it. It's nonfiction, and
Yeah.
but it's trying to speak to the mainstream audience about kind of making the comparison of what's going on with space now, with like the internet in the 90s. That you know,
Yeah.
we're building a lot of infrastructure right now, and there's going to be all sorts of applications that
Right.
we might not even be able to imagine stemming from space.
Oh, great. I'll get a copy. I will.
Yeah,
I
I've
will
heard about
order it
this
on
also.
Amazon.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah.
No,
And I know Paula.
don't send it to me. Make me
Oh,
buy it.
got it, okay.
You've got to learn this. You know,
Got it. Thank you.
authors' copies are great. I take them from close friends, but no, I want to buy your book,
Okay, thank you.
and I'm happy to do it.
Very
And I want to buy Paula's book when it's published. So
Yes, I would love
better
that.
get cracking.
I do, I know.
Good,
I've been
good.
through some real like, what do I do? And then other times when I'm madly writing,
Yeah.
you know, it's really up and
That's
down.
fine. You know, everybody's different. But you know what I like to tell people too when they're working on a book project, it can be very intimidating. You know, a book is not a small thing, and if you can write on average a page a day for a year, working 5
Oh,
days
that's-
a week,
That's
right?
that's the best. Yeah.
You'll have 200 pages. That's a book. You know what I'm saying? And everybody, you know, everybody runs a little hot and cold. You know, there are some writers who are very disciplined and could just sit down every day and, you know, write till noon or whenever.
That's what I want to be, but it hasn't happened.
That's what I want to be too, and it hasn't happened. But it doesn't matter because, again, you just got to keep your eye on the ball and say, if I write a page a day on average every week, by the end of the year, I will have my book, or most of it. You know what I'm saying? And a lot of writing, of course, is rewriting. So don't edit yourself too much while you're writing. Even if you think what you're writing is bad, keep going.
Just
'Cause
get it done so that you have
inevitably
something
you're-
to work with.
Exactly. Inevitably, you have to go back and rewrite it anyway, you know?
Oh,
So
that's
Andre,
good advice.
Yeah.
You like to, as I call it, think onto the page. That is, rather than deliberate about what to put down, you put down what comes to mind, go back and polish it later.
Yes, I do that. That's mostly how I try to work.
Yeah.
Now, unless I'm working with somebody else, you know, like TV is of course a very collaborative medium. And when we write the Orville, we have 7 people on the writing staff, including Seth. And we sit down in the writer's room every day for however many hours and we work on story ideas and we're all exchanging ideas and coming up with stuff. When I get down to write on my own, whether I'm writing a script or a magazine article or whatever, I try to just start typing, you know. I have an idea of what I want to say, but one of the things that's so interesting to me about the writing process is there is something that happens when you're sitting typing. Words and ideas, sentences occur to you that don't occur to you when you're just sort of sitting back and thinking about it. At least that's how it works for me.
Yeah,
There's
I
a
think
certain
your
magic.
mind gets into it.
Yeah,
It's presses
kind
a
of
button and it
a
starts.
magic in the process somehow.
Mhm.
You know, writing is an act of both creation and discovery. I discover ideas when I write that never would have occurred to me if I wasn't writing. And I don't know how that works. It's just a way of tapping into that subconscious process, you know, that place where, you know, interesting and new ideas come from. And sometimes I just have to get the crap out of my system. You know, sometimes I'll just sit and write something really stupid, you know, 2 pages worth of junk. It's just a way of kind of cleaning out the mental filters, you know. You know, Ray Bradbury, who I've met a number of times and worked with on a couple of projects, which was amazing. One of my favorite writers of all time. He said once that, you know, you got to write a lot of junk before you get to the good stuff, before you get to what's new. You got to get all the cliches out of your system. Because when you first start writing, you're consciously or subconsciously imitating the writers you really liked when you were growing up and reading, right? And that's okay. You just got to get it out of your system. And that may take you a few pages, a few weeks, a few months, a few years, whatever. But just keep
Just do
doing
it.
it. Yeah, you do it because, you know, the only way to learn how to write is by writing. And, you know, what's the key to writing a great story? Write a bunch of really bad stories. you know, and then you'll eventually start writing good stories. And then eventually you'll start writing great stories if you persist, you know. You have to
I
keep
had
at
the
it.
fortune of knowing Ray Bradbury as well.
Oh, that's great.
He told me to, this may be in one of his books, I don't know, but he actually just said this to me. He said, go to the edge of the cliff and grow your wings on the way down.
Yes. Yes, I've heard that. I've heard him say that. Jump
And
off the
it
cliff
always
and
has
build your
stuck
wings
with
on the
me.
way down. Yeah. It is about a certain level of fearlessness, because the fear is what causes you to self-censor. And if you constantly self-censor, you'll never get to what's real inside of you. And, you know, the only thing we can bring to the world is our own unique point of view. And it's hard to get to. And, you know, there are only so many certain kinds of stories in the world, right? You know, and there's always a certain pattern of, you know, like boy meets girl, you know, boy gets girl, boy loses girl, and all of those cliches, right?
Girl, get the boy.
Yeah,
That's what I want to know.
exactly. And that can happen too. But the thing that makes a story unique is your unique take on it, your unique voice and perspective. And you don't find that. Most people don't. I mean, some people are just natural born storytellers, but those are few and far between. That's rare. And most people have to learn the hard way. And Bradbury did, and, you know, most other writers that we all love. You know, you just keep cranking away at it. It took me a long time to work up the courage to try to write a short story, to try to write a poem. And the first, you know, my first efforts at that were crappy. And a lot of the efforts that I make today are still crappy. But once in a while, I find a little gem and I say, oh my God, that's a good idea. That's going to
You
make
have
a
to
good
just
story.
go with the gem.
Yeah. Or I just come up with a very funny line. I remember when we were working on Star Trek Enterprise, we had our crew's first landing on an alien planet. And this was a crew that was very green and very new to space exploration. And unlike Captain Kirk or Captain Janeway, where beaming down to a new planet is just another day at the office, these guys are like, oh my God, no human has ever been here before, right? And that was a unique way of looking at those stories, right? And the captain had a little dog, and he brought the dog on this away mission, and the dog jumps out of the shuttle with him. And I said, oh, we have to have a moment in this scene where Captain Archer's dog, Porthos, runs off into the bushes, and the first officer, Trip, says, where no dog has gone before. And, you know, it just came to me as we were talking about that story. And, you know, it's like, oh, that's funny. So that became a part of the script. And it was, you know, an off-sided line. And it's just because, you know, we were thinking and talking and, you know, what happens next? You know, what would you say if you were there? You know, what would you do? You know, put yourself in the shoes of the characters and try to understand their motives, their values, their perspectives. And then they'll start talking to you. And you just have to put down what they're saying, you know.
Create them.
It's almost like you're their instrument, right? That's the magic of it, if you can get there. And you get there by practicing and by trying that, and, you know, keep trying until it starts happening. And then it'll happen. And then for a while it might not happen again, but then it'll happen, you know. So it's not something you can really control. And the better you become at giving up control, I think the better writer you'll become.
Because then it's your intellect versus your creativity.
Yes. Yeah,
when
that's
you can
right.
give up the control.
That critical parent in you, that filter that's saying, no, that's wrong. You can't, no. You know, you got to ignore those voices.
Yeah.
At least when you're doing that first draft. Save those voices for when you're reading the first draft and trying to fix it and make it better. That's when you say, yeah, no, that's not very good. How can I make that better? You know?
Yeah, André, you're really the best combination in the world. You know, fiction, media, those things. The script writer. Actually, Mr. Jim French, you just talked to. He's our AIAA fellow.
Yes.
I don't know if he's a fellow, and he actually wrote a book with Dr. Mike Griffin. And the thing, you know, he told me 2 years ago we have the film screening event with Chesley Bonestell.
Oh yes.
The Brush of the Future.
Oh yes. You know, I went
and
to
he
one
told
of
me
those
that.
events.
Yeah, and we work with the film producer, Mr. Stewart.
Yes.
basically he was saying that the reason he got into become a rocket engineer because of, the science fiction and the painting, And a couple years ago, I think we have a kind of small poll. It turns out that the aerospace engineers feel that it's the Star Trek inspired them more than Star Wars for them to
Yes.
become, aerospace engineer. So actually, it's very interesting. It's I think it's a dual way. It works either way. So a lot of aerospace engineer was inspired by sci-fi, and then
Yes.
on the reversely, people have knowledge of science like you, engineer, actually, kind of inspire also, they do some great things in, inspire certain things, and also, some of the science fiction. I don't know if it's true or not, but a few years ago, we have the lady from Caltech. She was young lady. She said, she was did some small project on the side, the science fiction, and some science fiction 100 years ago actually predicted Elon Musk's name and the
Really?
role, because there was a novel. Forgot I said there's something about the first colony on Mars with a group of 12, leaders, and with the chief whose name was Elon. So everybody was laughing. Is science fiction predict the future, or actually Elon Musk,
Yeah,
or
right.
his father actually read a book?
Yeah.
So this is actually very important. The science fiction is the great intersection, for aerospace engineering, and also for the sci-fi, the film industry, or the books is you cannot imagine. It's so important. The fact you also expert in space policy, understand or inside out. That's very, very important. Just some comment, from
Yeah. Well,
you and
Carl
Jim had some
Sagan said
discussion.
Carl Sagan said he was inspired as a boy by the books of Edgar Rice Burroughs, which were more fantasy than science fiction, but it was about people traveling to Mars, and he was fascinated by that. So I think that fiction inspires young minds to dream. And when you realize that science and engineering is the tool for achieving those dreams, you're much more inclined to want to learn more about science and engineering.
Wow. So I also knew Carl Sagan.
Oh, great. I only met him a couple of times.
When I'm writing, I worked with him several times just by chance. It was very bizarre, but he would go, "Hey, Paula,"
Yeah.
and so now as I'm writing, I have Carl Sagan on one shoulder, and who did I just mention? Bradbury on the other. And Bradbury will say, don't worry about it. They don't have to have this. They didn't have any helmets or anything in his stories. And Carl will say, you really have to do this. So I kind of put one against the other.
Those are two good competing attitudes, right? So you get to navigate the path between them.
Yeah,
that's great.
They're both my advisors.
Yeah, well, you couldn't ask for better.
Very fortunate.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, this was really fun. I so enjoyed meeting all of you and talking with you, and I hope we get to do this again. And like I said earlier, I hope we get to do it in person sometime in the not too distant future.
Same here.
Yeah.
Hey, one event to keep an eye on is the National Space Society had planned to have its ISDC, its annual conference in LA next May. Comes back to LA every 3 years. It's kind of up in the air exactly how they're going to handle it. It may be a combination of online and in-person events, and I'm not even clear if the in-person events are still in LA. But if I hear anything, I'll spread the word. And I'm usually tuned into the organizing committee, although it seems to have formed without me. But I know who the leaders are, and if anyone's interested in participating, let me know, and I'll pitch an idea for a talk, a session, a book signing, or something like that.
Sure.
I don't know how you do book signing virtually, but I guess talk about
it. Can be done.
Yeah.
All righty.